Welcome, everyone. Good morning to day 2. I hope you're as excited as I am. So we're thrilled, as my colleague Annalie shared, we will have Dr. Poole back with us today. But also I'd like to take a moment to, again, thank Dr. Poole for your insightful engagement on day 1. You know, we were able to delve into various aspects of TVI practices. I really appreciated emphasis on safety, wordiness, and strengths and skills that underpin the work that we do, the very difficult and challenging work that we do, especially when we think about the limitations or the challenges as it relates to funding and sustainability. So Dr. Poole's discussion on trauma's centrality to women's health issues, including racism, sexism, equity, have really deepened, I believe, our understanding and commitment to resilient-oriented approaches. We also explored the evolving role of indigenous frameworks in addressing complex traumas and the importance of collective approaches to healing at both agency and systemic level. So we always talk about individual work, all the work that we do as individuals, but it's also good to touch in every space that we are to talk about systemic and structural issues that are most often beyond our own our control. So Dr. Poole's insight on integrating gender-informed and responsive work with boys and men, particularly through cultural initiatives like the YMCA's Culture Shift project in Vancouver, at least to me, was very invaluable. I appreciated the opportunity to really be intentional to bring men and boys into our engagement yesterday. So thank you for that. I'd also like to thank Catherine from Capital W. I don't know if you're here today, and Dr. Katrina Scott for the engagement and walkthrough of gender-based violence data platform. I know a lot of us, at least the tables that I sat at yesterday, had some questions, so let's hold on to those questions through today as well. Our discussions on collective impact and sustainability provided crucial perspective on how we can better inform organizational change and address trauma effectively. At yesterday's section, we had several opportunities to network because we heard from the advisory group, so thank you for all of those who participated, that you wanted opportunities to network, connect, get to know each other better. And we even had the opportunity via our knowledge mobilization activity, the design clinic, to ask questions. And as Annalie shared, we'll have the opportunity to continue that today. Lastly, last night, some of you joined us for some chit-chat and nibbles at Bagel, etc. And we thank you for that. So hopefully those conversations continue today as well. So this is a little bit of the recap and my reflection. I really left with a sense of gratitude. My team and we left with a sense of gratitude for everyone's participation. And there was a quote that stuck with me yesterday, and it was from Catherine from Capital W. So I'm embracing this because I will use it a lot. As a woman who is Black, and we've been in and out of spaces where the work and very Eurocentric approaches don't often align with my values. I love this. She said, instead of being invited to the table, how about we set the table? I really love that. So I'm giving this to everyone. Instead of us engaging and constantly pushing, we should not hold back when we have our ideas and our perspective to share in spaces. So I hope you hold on and hone on to that quote as well. Now, as we look forward to an exciting day 2, I don't need to go over the agenda. Annalie already did that. I'm going to leave us with some reflection questions just to ponder throughout the day. And as the social worker in me, I always say practice reflexivity as well. So through the process of today, you can also be reflexive in your engagement. 1, how can we integrate the insights on trauma, racism, sexism, and equity into our daily practices to foster a more inclusive and supportive environment? 2, in what ways can we further incorporate indigenous frameworks and collective approaches to healing within our agencies and systems? And that also includes other framework as it relates to working with diverse demographic, i.e. individuals who are Black, the 2 LGBTQ+ communities as well. And the third reflection point I have for us today, how can we actively set the table for diverse voices and perspectives in our work rather than wanting to be invited. Remember the quote? So how can we take initiatives? Okay, so now I welcome back Dr. Poole. Thank you for your continued contributions, and we are excited for day 2. Thank you.
Hang on. Thank you. Okay, good. So we talked a lot yesterday about these 4 principles of trauma-informed practice. The bringing in awareness of trauma in everything we do, so that awareness principle. The idea of safety in all its formats and building trust. We talked about how we bring voice, choice, collaboration, connection, and control into the mix. And thinking about some approaches that we integrate in our projects that allow for skill building and wellness, including the projects that are specifically about that around movement and trauma-informed yoga and art-based work, etc. So you'll notice on the sheet, I've added below those initial ideas for integration within our projects with clients, some additional words down the side that speak a bit more to the agency level work of doing this. So in the context of awareness and bringing that principle in, I've added the term social learning, which comes from Dr. Sandra Bloom's work and the sanctuary model. But thinking about awareness at the agency level, I think is a lot about us learning together and continuing to learn together, like we've been doing here, is creating the formats within our organizations, like debriefing meetings, etc., that allow us to just be reflexive and think about what we're doing and how it's working, not in the context of crisis only, like debriefing normally is, but in that wider way. Thinking about safety and the integration of physical, emotional, cultural, social safety is thinking about how we as an organization are emotionally intelligent. Is the way that Sandra Bloom talks about it, is really thinking about how are we connecting to our own needs for safety, trust, connection together as an agency. In the area of opportunities for voice and choice and collaboration and connection, really thinking about how are our organizations democratic? How are we actually bringing ideas for being trauma-informed and doing all our other work in a way that filters this idea of collective change together throughout, whether it's in our supervision work or whether it's in our planning work or whatever, that we are leveling the playing field and generating that kind of collaboration that we're also hoping to do with participants in our research or our programs. And finally, just thinking about the honoring of strengths and resilience part of trauma-informed approaches, thinking about our self-care and our collective care as we do this work. And I'm going to spend a fair bit of time talking about that part of it this morning. But I thought as we go along, you may want to add some ideas in, and you may already have thought about it as we talked about things yesterday, is thinking about what the stretch forward is, plus building on what we're already doing well, especially as we try and think about being more about equity and gender-informed and anti-racist, etc., as we do this work. I think the people from CREVAC may have sent this to you online as a fillable document, so I really encourage you to think about using this document when you come back to your teams to think through this stuff together and use it as an exercise in collective reflection on our trauma-informed work and using it so that everyone can participate in it, not only those of us who have it as a handout. So before I go into the piece today, which is more about bringing trauma and violence informed principles and practices into our agency cultures and advocating for system change, I just wanted to ask if there was anything from yesterday that anybody wanted to mention or was niggling at them, something we talked about that you'd like to say something more about. And by the way, I'm not gonna pick on you today to say things like I did yesterday, so it's totally voluntary today, whether you say anything. But anything from yesterday standing out that you'd just like to mention before we get going? We're good? All right. So this picture comes from an amazing group in California who are actually trying to bring about or advocate for change in California's cannabis laws. And they were doing it from a trauma-informed perspective and a collective community perspective. And I just thought it was such a powerful statement of an organization that was largely about adverse childhood experiences and working with families in a relational way on the community level, decided to get together and talk about political change. And it reminded me of yesterday's work with capital W and thinking big and thinking about how we, in this case, the people said, we can't leave social change to the politicians. We need to be able to define the kind of change we want and to pull that through. And so they made an incredible, I really encourage you to look at their slide deck and at the whole thing that they were able to pull off. It is absolutely lovely, including a piece along the way which also reminded me of the capital W presentation yesterday that they called, that's built on a book that's called Compassionomics. And it's about, economics and social change and financial structuring of our world and capitalism, etc., that comes from a place of compassion, building on a trauma-informed location rather than one of scarcity and competition. So, what I was hoping to do was to talk a little bit about these other levels of trauma-informed practice today, beyond what we're doing with service users or research participants. And there's lots of tools around for doing this. This is one of them. I don't know whether Colleen Varco mentioned this tool last year when she talked to you about trauma-informed approaches, but it's a great tool from the Canadian Public Health Association that they did in collaboration with the Centre for Sexuality. And it does talk about how We can reduce stigma related to sexually transmitted diseases through using a trauma-informed approach. And they spend a lot of time in it talking about how you can support staff development and how you can build an action plan as your organization in terms of being trauma-informed. And you know, it's just one of many places where you can find that. In this document that we did with the BC government a decade ago, more than a decade ago now, we did build in the back of it as well a bit of a checklist about what are we already doing around being trauma-informed, what are the criteria, how do we rate ourselves, and what might be the stretch in terms of improving the way we're going. And at the time, I resisted having a checklist because I said, you know, trauma-informed practice is not really a checklist kind of thing. But over time, people came back to me and said, by the way, this is still downloaded, I forget how many times, like 500 times a month from our website. Like I cannot believe how much people are still keen to think through how they do trauma-informed approaches. But the people came back to me and said, you know what? The material was so great, but the checklist was what was super helpful in terms of us being able to think through what we're doing as an organization together and moving along. Anyway, so it just reminded me to listen to what people want rather than just going with your own instincts only about how to teach and support learning around trauma-informed approaches. So I really encourage you to think about how the work is being done as an organization, not only in relation to your project by itself. This group from Oregon called Trauma-Informed Oregon, it's an amazing website, and as they say, they're a centralized source of information and resources for trauma-informed efforts. But they say that the benchmarks for trauma-informed implementation are that your leadership is on side about it, that you are thinking always about how safe the environments are that you're creating in the context of your whole organization as well as your projects. And you know, we in the Strong Women Project, that's part of this group of projects funded by PHAC, are really challenged to think about physical safety in the context of the virtual support group we're creating. And it challenges us to think about how are we communicating ourselves online, as well as how are we really understanding the meaning of it for women who've experienced violence and have substance use concerns. So it pulls us forth always in terms of thinking about how do we experience the online environment? What are the challenges that we have with it? What does it give us? What does it take away? As we work as a team, as well as how we bring it into the project. The thing that I think is really important in our thinking is about how we as workers are involved in self-care, agency care, system change, social learning together, etc. And there's a lot of tools on this site as well as many other places, a lot of recommendations about how do you build it in as an organization. I spent some time working with the Ministry for Children and Families in BC, the provincial child welfare department, about what it would mean to be trauma-informed as a government department. It was a large challenge, as you can imagine. But what I just wanted to point out what we came to in the end as the importance of the work. That yes, they needed to think about trauma-informed in terms of supporting children and youth. They needed to think about that from a gender and cultural and developmental lens, and they needed to involve families and peers. And they thought that was basically what they'd hired me to do. But as we spent time together, we realized that that was only half of the issue. The important other half of the work was worker wellness and safety, agency culture and policies and action by leadership. That it was fully important that they engaged with that side of trauma-informed practice, because what was happening was social workers came in, burnt out, moved on. And they never questioned the fact that there were reasons why that kind of turnover happened, because they weren't engaging with that side of the equation. They were thinking that, if we're about children, we can only be about children, and we can't be about the workers and the leadership and our whole culture. And it was a really interesting process. It's by no means enacted, but I continue to work with them on some small ways. And the document is online if any of you are interested in looking at where they came to in terms of what it would mean to be trauma-informed as an organization. That's called Healing Families, Helping Systems. And I tried to get them to rephrase that to helping families and healing systems, but I couldn't pull that off quite. But we did get the overall idea there for them, that unless their workers were well, unless their agency culture was a trauma-informed one, there was no way they were going to be able to deliver trauma-informed care to families. And I think it's kind of a metaphor for us all as we're thinking about our projects, is how can we be as well and as thoughtful about creating trauma-informed approaches as we do these projects about violence against women and girls. So lots to think about, I think, as we take this journey down the road on this process. Any comments on that kind of framing of what it looks like to be trauma-informed at the organizational level? All right. So I mentioned Sandra Bloom along the way, and people have gone about being trauma-informed at the organizational level and the pushing for leadership and system change in a lot of different ways. And one of the things that she's been so good at is leading the thinking around it from these basic sort of principles as opposed to checklists. Right? So there's no right and wrong way, but I just think that her idea of having an organization commit to nonviolence, emotional intelligence, social learning, open communication, social responsibility, democracy, and growth, what is a really cool way of thinking about what is our work here in terms of enacting these projects. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. She's written a lot of different books. This one is an interesting one that spends a lot of time on these commitments. And the subtitle is A New Operating System for Trauma-Informed Systems of Care. And I just think it's kind of interesting because she's using the analogy of computers, that we need to just get rid of the current operating system and enact a new one that's based on entirely different principles than the way we've gone about it so far. So this is one of the key concepts in terms of being trauma-informed at the organizational level and being able to pull off systemic change work, is that we are well as workers. And it's been really interesting to see all the different ways in which people have been thinking about worker wellness. And surprising ways too, like Indigenous women in Western Australia making mindfulness apps. Really interesting, thoughtful ways about how are we doing in terms of our own wellness. The more traditional thing in the center, from olgaphoenix.com, about the various aspects of our lives, physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual, personal, and professional, is in that list too. And how are we finding balance amongst those different parts of our lives. Lots of interesting ideas on their website about self-care. And finally, those of you from Vancouver may recognize the picture of Vicki Reynolds there and her idea of the zone of fabulousness. She is an amazing leader in trauma-informed approaches and really advocates for the fact that we need to, as teams, collectively care for our clients or research participants. And we need to engage with that, not from a place of thinking that we're going to burn out or be harmed by engagement with people with violence histories, but that we're going to grow and change with that when we're in this zone of fabulousness that's really focused on the client care and our own work together in doing it. So she has lots of great, Vicki with an I, on her website. But I do think that the moment we start talking about self-care, often in the past, it has seemed like a really individual thing that, we shouldn't be focusing on that only. And of course, we shouldn't be focusing on that only. But I think more and more people are starting to recognize that our ability to be centered and wise and supportive really matters in doing this work on being trauma-informed. And that it in itself is a radical act of not going pell-mell, burning out, overextending, thinking we're doing the right thing, but spending more time thinking about how our own self-care and our ability to connect to those we're working with is a powerful thing. And the feminists in the room may enjoy the quote from Audre Lorde about caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And I think that captures this idea that we're in right now of how much we need to think about what is wellness, how do we get to wellness, how do we stay well ourselves as we're doing this important work. And this whole toolkit in terms of working with youth, I think, is a really interesting one. And they're applying that idea of self-care to youth as well. So let's stop there for a moment and take 5 minutes at your tables to talk a little bit about how self-care fits in with the work that we need to be doing. So let's just take a few moments to reflect on self-care as a radical act, as part of being trauma-informed, and where you need to go and your organization needs to go in supporting that. So I think that idea of collective debriefing is a really important one that we can do and make central. And many of the others from your table about having Fridays off or doing something on Fridays together have often mentioned that they take time on Fridays to have lunch together or go for a walk together and ask these questions of themselves, that it doesn't need to be only in a room with a flip chart or whatever. It can be just a commitment to reflecting together on where we're going, what's happening, and where we can move from here. And I think that it creates that kind of thinking about how we can make social change. I just wanted to go back to this idea of the whole team in terms of wellness. This research done by Trauma Informed Oregon was interesting in terms of what they saw as mitigating the experience of secondary trauma. And that when they did the research, they found, a bit like Vicki Reynolds, that the protective factors were that you felt part of a team and had social support, and that you could see change as a result of your work. You have tangible evidence that your work is important and helpful. And I just thought it was a great statement of how we can be well as organizations, of really thinking about having team that value social support and democracy and all the principles of Sandra Bloom, and that we can connect to that positive, not only to the side of what's going wrong, but being able to see that we are making change. And clearly, training and supervision matter. And this one I thought was a really interesting one, this idea, and in the case of the Ministry for Children and Families in BC, just recognizing that the social workers who are seeing families could have other work to do other than only casework. But they had a break to do some other kinds of work within their caseload. And that made a huge difference for them being able to avoid burnout. And so that does take us to this place of vicarious resilience, this concept that is now starting to be more central in the trauma field. The positive, transformative process experienced by people who are helping professionals to working with trauma survivors, that we can benefit from seeing the ways in which people are healing and growing, and turn our attention to that idea of what's working as opposed to what's not working. And really, from the Compassionomics folks, can actually see how we can build resilience and resistance to burnout by relating as opposed to seeing relatedness as a burden. So lots to think about. Oh, there's one of my morning walk flowers, by the way. It's not bad, eh?
Is it in BC? Or
Yes, BC.
Very nice.
So back to these people that I started with, to think about how they have been able to move the action towards political action and political advocacy is to really collectively think about how they can bring culturally responsive, racially just, healing-centered, and trauma-informed approach to guide how expenditures are made in California on some of these social change issues, like cannabis and support for children and families. And I really encourage you to have a look at some of the ways in which they achieve that through training and capacity for all staff, cross-sectoral collaboration. They brought in so many people together. And to try and create an enduring and purposeful infrastructure that supports reflection, learning, innovation, and the scaling of support for innovations. And it really, I just thought it was so interesting how the capital W presentation yesterday really reinforced these as the kind of visionary ways forth for us, and that we can achieve that by working together and really making trauma-informed as a way of centering the work. So I just wanted to end with one last slide about from the people also in California, from the traumainformed.org folks, that really talk about how we can have trauma-informed systems and how we can really build our own leadership competencies for being having trauma-informed systems, and to think about the work of us as leaders in making change that's built on this idea of relational leadership that supports resilience and recovery. That really supports doing critical inquiry together, embracing complexity as we've tried to do today, to think about what is this piece down the center that really we need to filter our work through. And always thinking about how we're being inclusive and how we're communicating in a trauma-informed way, to be able to come up with these ideas of cultural humility and equity, compassion, collaboration, resilience, etc.
So we're going to come back together slowly.
Alors pour la prochaine présentation, on va avoir une présentation de la part de Alice, Debbie et Melissa.
So for the next presentation,
Je vais présenter un peu
we'll be hearing from Alice, Melissa, and Debbie.
Alice, Melissa et Debbie à venir me rejoindre.
I'll give you a little bit of background to the presentation. I'd like to ask Alice, Debbie, and Melissa to come forward.
Avec l'approche holistique et
Now, this is where I come from, Noshimik, where I come from. And that's healing, a holistic and Intikamev approach. So first of all, this presentation will address the impacts of the Indian Act and the intergenerational trauma, the residential schools, systemic racism, as well as forced sterilization and abuse. And secondly, they'll be speaking to the issues of resilience and healing, and they will mainly focus on how one can put in place the holistic and Intikamev approach, and how can this can contribute to the healing process, and as well as fostering the identity of Intikamev without revisiting victimization. So Alice, Melissa, and Debbie. It's always very emotional to present our approach. My first thoughts are for my brother, Gilles. He is in hospital at this time due to all of the trauma that he's experienced. I have some positive thoughts for him, and I'm sending him positive energy, light. And I send myself and Debbie and Melissa also light so that we can walk together over this red path, as we call it. That's the path of healing as part of our holistic approach. As I was saying to my sisters earlier, I'm going to rest and meditate before we come to our meeting, which is an important one. It is key. From time to time, we need to rest from our lives, take some time off before we come back to our brothers and sisters. That is you. So we'd like to invite you to do a brief activity. Before we start, I'd like to ask my sisters, Debbie and Melissa, if this is okay for them, that we do this activity together. We do it all together. So I'm going to ask you to do this. To please stand up. So for all of us, as human beings, all of us are the children of our Mother Earth. I'd like to ask you to walk and go see your neighbor and to turn to your neighbor and say thank you for being here. And to also shake hands and even give a hug. It's nice to get hugs and to give hugs. Now that is beautiful energy. Hugs are good. This is wonderful. I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank all of you for taking part in that wonderful reconciliation activity. I'd also like to say miigwech, which means thank you in our Atikamekw language. So miigwech, to you, thank you to you for coming here on our sacred earth, because we have to respect our Mother Earth. We would like to thank the immigrants, the refugees, the people from Spanish from having settled here. And it's wonderful to get a hug. And it is great to hug as we go along. But especially, first of all, it's important to look at ourselves, to look at the slate we have, and it's only then that we can turn towards others to put forward reconciliation. Thank you, Debbie. As well, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for doing this work that makes a difference to other persons, for those suffering from sexual and family violence. Thank you so much for making a difference, to give them a glimmer of hope, because that person can become a great person, such as myself, Debbie, Melissa, and all of you. So we're going to begin our work. We called it Nutsmik, where I come from. That is where I come from. That is where we all come from. This is our territory. That is where our healing lies as well. For the Atikamekw. It's beautiful, isn't it? That's our territory. I took a few pictures like that, just like we heard earlier from the doctor. Pool, we've taken many pictures of landscapes and people as well. I have 2 mics. Here's a picture that shows our great-great-grandmothers. These are our great-great-grandmothers when they would come together as women, when they would have meetings. Often they would sit at the edge of the lake. They were sitting on the grass, and they took the time to smoke their pipes, as we call them, cocoons. And it's when they took the time to talk. They took the time to have talks amongst women, to give each other advice, to settle conflicts. And as well is where they prepared the way for other women as well. And they're wearing skirts, they're wearing scarves, and berets. And the mountain that you see in the background is a sacred mountain for the community. The sacred mountain was for women. Because that is also where they held ceremonies. These were grief ceremonies, as well as ceremonies for grieving for stillborn children, and women, ceremonies for the uterus. So they would have ceremonies there where they brought together women, and this is a very sacred women. It is a maternal mountain. So under our holistic approach, Nutsmik means where I come from. Havridisto means it's balance, a balance in a person. And across the Atikamekw territory, we have many stories of events that have taken place, of births, and even where there were wars between nations. This is also a vast land. There are 3 Atikamekw communities there. We're about 7,000 in total. This vast territory is divided into 3 parts. Atikamekw Abuchwan, Atikamekw Dumontache, and Atikamekw Amwamwan. And in these 3 territories, these are also divided into 3 because they're family clans. So we have guardians of the territory, we have chiefs, we also have guardians for the territory such as us, because we also occupy that territory. We've conducted a great deal of research on the territory as women, because in the past, the territory was governed by women. So we're still doing the history of our history to find out what happened in these places. As well, we organize a lot of activities on the land to heal. And I belong to I'm one of the ambassadors of these large expeditions that I took part in. So what I've done is that I've met with a lot of women from other nations, the Quebec Nation and Haitian as well, and I was able to meet these on indigenous lands such as physicians, professors, and from other ethnic groups as well. And we spoke a great deal about resilience and healing. And it's now been a few years that I've been working for my community and that I've been involved in the status of women. As well, I've been working for youth in order to transmit our culture. So to that end, we hold traditional activities. And I've done a lot of research as well on medicinal plants, on ceremonies, on the rites of passage, as well on birth ceremonies and first steps ceremonies, the water ceremony, as well as the full moon ceremony. And my grandmother once told me is that you're never going to stop learning. Throughout your entire life, you're going to continue to learn, because I'm still learning every day. Even though I'm very old, I still learn. So the way that I can contribute to healing in the community is that it's now been some 30 years ago when I was young, and I learned many things thanks to my mother-in-law. I learned how to sew. I learned how to build a camp. For instance, when we have a camp, well, there we heard about reconciliation, we heard about residential schools, and I saw that the community was in shock. The women that I was with were living through something that had to be shared, it had to be expressed. And I was often there to support women and to listen to them. At a certain point, I had an idea. I wanted to organize an activity to make skirts. So why a skirt? Well, in the history of skirts, it's like having a teepee. It's when you see the structure of a teepee that's similar to a skirt. And when you're inside the teepee, you can look up and you see the starry sky, you see the light of the sun. But in the skirt, it's like when we're inside the belly of our moms. And that's what gave me the idea of organizing this activity. And also, I wanted each woman to weave her color into the skirt and to respect herself as a woman. Because when you wear a skirt, that's also sacred, because it means that we're in connection with our Mother Earth as a woman. And ever since then, I've been continuing with the workshop, and women from the community asked me why I was doing this. And more women hold these activities in their own communities now. And I have lots and lots of skirts there. And I've received many, and I also give skirts away as a gift. There are many things that I would like to share with you, but this was one of the most important ones, because when I made a skirt the first time, it was very tough. Because I was assaulted and when I was wearing a skirt. And it was difficult for me the first time when I made a skirt, because that's what it made me think about. And I understood that this was a form of healing for me. And the women that I was with and the ones that came to my workshops had similar stories, and they would share them with me. And we also held many ceremonies. These were healing ceremonies, as well as skirt ceremonies. We had full moon ceremonies, as well as sharing circles. And at a certain point, my body was responding, and I had to take a break. I needed to take a break, and I had to delegate organizing these activities to somebody else. And today, and this is continuing, but I took another path, and it was also territorial occupation. We created a canoe camping project, and this is the 8th year that we've been doing it. But also took part in other territorial explorations in the wintertime. These were expeditions. It's also physically extremely demanding, as it is mentally difficult, because you have all kinds of emotions, you're young. And throughout the expeditions, we also wondered about what everybody had been through. What are the issues that they're experiencing? And we would guide them to the right services. We met with about 500 people throughout the course of our expeditions. As well, we do teaching during the expedition because some elders accompany us. We also have women and men elders, and Sometimes we also have other people like physicians and nurses who come with us, as well as guides on the land who are very familiar with the land, with the lakes, the rivers, the actual land. And at the same time, we're training young people. We can explain to youth how you use a canoe, how do you rescue someone, and we also explain to them the toponymy of the lakes and rivers and where the sediments are, and it is a form of healing as well, because it really brings families together, and it's something that we're proud of. We're very proud of these activities. It's reconciliation in our own community, in the family.
Two years ago, I was invited to take part in a vast expedition. I was one of the female ambassadors. For the women that disappeared and were missing and murdered. We did 5,000 kilometers in winter for the whole province of Quebec. And it was really very difficult. At least 45 degrees. And physically, it was very demanding, and mentally as well. We also met several people from the community, from the Cree and Algonquin communities, even in the Naskapi Nation in Schefferville. We met some Innu people. 2 days before I got there, I had an accident. I was ejected from my snow machine. With all the adrenaline that was pumping through me and the cold around me, I didn't really feel anything. But after 3 days, once I finished my expedition, I went to see a doctor in Trois-Rivières. I got an x-ray, and I had fractured my arm. And every time I would think of my pain, I would think of the girls that had been murdered. I thought about my parents in the residential schools. I thought of Joyce. I thought of all of that, of all of the children in the residential schools that were never able to return home. And every time I told myself, you can get through this. You've already gone through so much, you can do it again. So everything was channeled through this force. And it's thanks to this force that I was able to complete my expedition. So I went for physiotherapy because I had another mission. I wanted to go on another expedition. So I did physiotherapy for 3 months, and then I went on my expedition. I learned a lot. I grew a lot through these expeditions. I heard a lot of stories, sad stories. Sometimes quite funny. They really received us like, I don't know how to say it even. Everyone took such good care of us in every community where we went. I received moccasins, mittens. People were thinking of their brother, their sister, their parent. we received a lot of gifts. Traditional medicine, ceremonies, feasts. Going into each community, we could see that there was a reconciliation among nations, among indigenous nations. For the past 7 years, I've been invited to schools so that I could share what we've lived through. And as well, I'm invited as a woman. Okay, I'll hand the mic over to Melissa Miigwech. So my name is Melissa Coutu. I work work with people. I work on the ground. I work in social crisis in the Friendship Center. We've been talking about trauma since yesterday. I'm in contact with all of these people who have traumas. We talk about this activity. Well, that's how we do things with our people. In the Friendship Center, it's really important to welcome people, you know, when people come, because what's important in the Indigenous being is really what you're doing. Is somebody going to listen to me? Is someone going to take their time with me, or will they rush me? Will they leave? It's a lot of relationships, a lot of helping relationships. A lot of management. We all know each other. We're all family. We're all cousins. So I can't say, oh, I can't work with this person because she's part of my family. So conflicts of interest, you know, we see them every day. And that's a bit of what's special in the Indigenous context. I work in an urban environment in Trois-Rivières. We have a lot of Atikamekw peoples in Trois-Rivières from 3 communities. This is a city that also welcomes students. And I've been gone for about 11 years. I studied at Collège La Flèche. I'll talk to you a little bit about what I've done so far. I went back to school at 35 years old to go to college. I have a son who is 21 today. My son has special needs. He's autistic, level light. And I left 11 years ago because my son needed services that we didn't have in our community. So by leaving the community, I thought, well, I'll be in the city, so I'll go back to school. So I went back to school. I did a double deck. I went to Collège La Flèche. I worked in childhood education because I always babysat children. I wasn't sure what I'd do with my career path at that time. And then I pursued a specialized education path because I thought, well, if one day my son no longer has access to services, well, at least I'll be able to provide them to him. So I concluded my studies in 2018 and I became part of the Friendship Center's family. And then COVID came and it hit hard, especially in Trois-Rivières. You know, workers were in high demand, services as well. So I continued my schooling. I'm still a student. I'm currently studying childhood and family intervention. That's really my field, but this in an Indigenous context in Val d'Or. Why? You know, we have a university in Trois-Rivières. Why would I go to Val d'Or? Well, because there are no courses in Indigenous context in Trois-Rivières. So this is why I chose Val d'Or. I found that I needed to learn because it's not that long ago that I learned my story. You know, I always lived in the city when I was young. I lived in my community 5 years, and then I left again for Trois-Rivières. Before I used to live in the region of Lanaudière-Joliette. That's where I grew up. I was victim of intimidation, discrimination. And that's why when my son was born and he was of a school age, I thought I'm not going to stay here with my child. I will go back home in my community because I don't want him to be facing all of those things. So we talked about the Indian Act. That's one of our favorite topics. In fact, this morning, I gently talked about the topic. We are the only people who are governed by a law, by an act, which means that I have a band number which is hung in my community, in Madouane. And that means that because I have this band number, people think, how would you say, people think we have privileges. But I would say that these are privileges with a knife in the back. Here's a few examples. When I'm in my community, when I want services, if I have to go to a medical appointment, I am entitled to transportation, to lodgings. Because I'm in my community, I have someone who will take me to my appointment. And all of that, well, the fees are paid for by the federal government because he gives us funding for these types of things. I leave the community, and now I live in a city, and I no longer have a right to these services. So, you know, I know they're called reserves, but we say community because I don't like the mot reserve. And it's the same thing for services in education. We don't have services for our children in schools. We have a gap in services, and we have a lot of needs. If I leave the community, well, I have even fewer services. So when I left my community, I was a student, and what really helped me were the external services that were offered. People are there for students, and these are people from our communities, and they're there to encourage us. They do activities with us for the whole duration of our studies. They also help us during the summer to find a summer job. And this allowed me to get to know the services in the city when I arrived there because I didn't know anything about Trois-Rivières. So this is when I got into the hospital system with my son, but I was worried. I was worried that my son would be taken away from me, that I wouldn't be understood. So it's that fear that people live when they come to this city, that they won't use the services, they won't go to the hospital, they won't contact youth services or youth protection services. And then let's talk about taxes. When I'm in my community, I don't pay taxes, but the price will be higher. When I leave my community, I pay taxes everywhere. If I work within my community, then I don't pay taxes, but if I leave the community, then I do. I'm speaking about this because I often give presentations in the Trois-Rivières schools, in organizations, and in businesses, and these are questions I get asked every time. Taxes. What else? We have services. Let's say that I had a child. My father's a Quebecer, my mother's Atikamekw. So if I had a son he would be Métis. So if my son was born from a Quebecois father, my son would lose his band. But my son's father is Atikamekw, which means that he received his band number. At the time, when a man would marry someone who was an Indigenous, the Allochtons would lose their status, would keep their status. If an Indigenous woman married a person who was not Indigenous, she would lose her status, and often she would get expelled from the community. It was a very racist law and very patriarchal. So we were a matriarchal society, and what did that change in communities? Well, that meant that it was men who decided everything from now on without having to consult the women. So the man and the woman's role were completely perturbed. We didn't have a right to speak anymore. And then the band councils were derived from the Indian Act, because the band councils are basically our mini government. If I need to go get an Indian status card or a request for housing, I will go to my band council and everything gets done there. Even my appointments, I'm not the one who makes them. Someone manages my appointments within the community. So the government wanted us to depend on it. And it's hard to leave that system, because once we leave the community, we need to be able to make our own appointments, to go towards people, because it's not people who are coming towards you. But in our community, we're used to having all the services coming to us. Okay. What else? So I told you that we were dependent upon this system and that it was hard to leave it, because when I got to the city, it was really hard. It was as if I was living a cultural shock. You know, when we talk about time, the time flew by. In my community, time doesn't work that way. And that law holds us. We're basically transformed into children. We're not allowed to make our own decisions. If I die one day, it's my band council that will manage everything that relates to my assets. Anyway, we're not allowed to have any assets. We don't have a house that belongs to us. We don't have land that belongs to us. It all belongs to the band council. So if I have a house in my community, I'll be paying rent for life. It will never be my own house. And then the Indian Act still exists today. It hasn't been changed at all. We've been fighting for change, and we haven't been heard yet. You know, we talk about reconciliation, and that would really be one of the first things that we need to work on, is that act. The Indian Act was created during the will for assimilation. It also created wars between nations, because there are communities saying, no, you can't have children with Atikamekw peoples. You're going to be having children with your nation. We also have communities who are refusing to have non-Indigenous people, because things went sour, and now they're saying, no, we don't want it anymore. We don't want any more non-Indigenous people living on our territory. So it goes back quite far to the residential schools, to the Indian Act. I'm not recognized with my SIN number or my name. Will ask me my band number, and as soon as I say I have a band number, well, then I'm set aside. Apart from the others, when I went to school, I was always set apart in classrooms. You know, they told me I couldn't learn. I was unable to learn. I always had learning difficulties, but that wasn't true. We have different ways of learning. We learn by observing and by living the experience of what we're observing. And when we're talking about trauma, I'll come back to that. We're talking about activities. And I have to say, our people are less afraid of participating in an activity where they can actually move around, where they can speak up. They might talk about their trauma. I worked in sexual violence in schools, and I had youth that weren't speaking up. Well, we have to get them moving. You have to create a link first. That's the base. And then you start moving with the youth.
The residential schools now. It's hasn't been that long for us. My mother went to a residential school, and the last one closed in 1996. There's been a great deal of impact from these residential schools on us. We're still living with this. And what's been the result? It's an ongoing wheel. We have the sense that it's a never-ending loop. It's violence, it's sexual assault, it's alcoholism. It's just a wheel that we're still stuck in. The children were taken away from their families. And when they arrived at the residential schools, they were given numbers. They were never called by their names. They didn't ask them what community they came from. They each had a number. Their hair was cut because we have a relationship with our hair. It's very important to us. Their hair was cut. They were forbidden from speaking their own language. Otherwise, they were severely punished. They had to learn French. They were forced to learn French. And when children went back home, they were completely lost. We lost a whole part of our culture because we transmit culture through our elders. And my father showed me the forest, and after that, each person would transmit to the next person. We're a very verbal culture, an oral culture. So that's how we would learn. That was what mattered to us. But all of this was lost because of the residential schools. And the roles as well were turned upside down, especially when it came to parents. So we had young girls who would get pregnant and the grandfather would step in. And the young person no longer knew, look, well, I don't have to take care of my child. I already have my grandfather who will take care of the child. And that's still very much the case today with our people. It's still very difficult. And earlier, Debbie said that there have been a lot of reactions to it. We also saw this during COVID. There was a class action suit filed in the communities, launched by persons who were in residential schools. This triggered a great deal of reaction. People once again started to drink a lot of alcohol because this really brings back all of these memories. And the government, rather than saying, look, yes, there has been a class action suit, but we will provide services to ensure that there will be help. If there's a social crisis, we will implement projects. No, people received certain amounts of money, so people began to drink a lot more. And obviously these social difficulties continued and everything was exacerbated during COVID. What was another effect? It's intergenerational. Earlier I spoke about that wheel, but this is still ongoing. My mother went to residential schools, and I had to go to residential schools. And the reason I was supposed to go, I didn't go because my father didn't want me to go. I'm saying that because my father also went to residential school, and he said that that was not a good place for children. Whereas my mother, she thought that it was the best place for me to go. A bit like what Alice was saying this morning. I also had a moment where I realized that was it. And I've wanted a great deal because my mother today is very religious. She has been very ill in her life. And she often says it's prayer that has helped her. And it's religion that has helped her. But since we know all of this, and now that we know all about the impacts of residential schools, I think it helps me to understand why my mother is who she is. We've all experienced that loss of identity. I lost my language when I was young, and I had a very ambitious grandma who said, no, you won't be like others, like your cousins, because I want you to speak in a Tikimevik. And she was very perseverant when it came to my learning the language, and today I'm very grateful to her because I speak it. because it also helps me in my work. People speak better in Tigamek when they're experiencing difficult things, and it's important to establish a trust relationship. It's important to be able to speak in your own language. I don't know if anybody has questions for us. If you have any questions at any point, please let us know. We did have a table of contents. We didn't quite follow every point, but that doesn't matter. Don't worry. This is really based on our own life experience that we're speaking as women, as Atikamekw women. We're speaking about our experience. And we're also speaking about the healing path that is underway. We also work in the field. So if you have any questions for us as we go along, please feel free to raise your hand and we're going to answer your questions, given all of our backgrounds. So yes, we talked about the residential schools. Oh yes, that's right, it is my turn. So Awakak, little being of light. So what you're seeing here, and again, I do also have to see it, is why we have it called Awasak. These are little beings of light. That's how this is translated in our language. And again, thank you to my friend for having shared. There have been many missing and murdered children. You've spoken, we've heard about this a great deal, and I won't dwell on it because we've already talked about it. 3 members of my own family have disappeared. We're looking for my little sister and another sister whose body will be exhumed shortly. But my sister, she would celebrate her birthday if she were alive, the 21st of July. To make a long story short, my mother had her child on the 21st of July in 1973. My little sister became ill. And that is the justice that Melissa spoke about. My mother had to send her sick child to Joliet, to go from our community to Joliet. This was in 1972. That was when the road was built later. You could not go by car, you had to take a plane. So people didn't allow my mother to get on a plane with a 3-month-old baby who was ill to go to hospital. My father also was there with my little sister and went to the hospital, was hospitalized there. Then they sent her to a Quebec foster family, and they kept her. And then they brought her to the hospital, and my little sister died in the hospital. In fact, when we've done research, there are 3 death dates. It's incomprehensible. So we did more research with the government of Canada to find my little sister. We found where apparently she was buried, but again, is it her? Because when my mother went to see her daughter, because she was told that her daughter had died, her child was about 3 years old and not 3 months. So in her mind, that was not her daughter. There have been a lot of disappearances. Many children were taken. In Kamloops, in Western Canada, many children were found buried under the residential schools. This is really sad. Many children never came home. And that is one of the consequences that we've seen. So I'm living that. My parents died 2 years ago. Within a month and a half, my dad died of COVID and my mother let herself die because she was unable to survive without her husband. But she was also very ill. And there are 6 children of us. We were 9, 3 had disappeared. We're still looking for our little sisters and for the other members of the family. So that's the story of my parents. It's something that I'm still carrying with me today. So we will soon be exhuming the bodies. And I don't know at all if that's her. My mother was sure that it was not her. So that is our story. And this is in English, that's in French over here. So I mentioned the story, the Loriana Equin story. And some children were found. That's a good thing. I also have children. And some children were sent to other communities because they didn't know where they came from. Some children ended up in a community where families took care of that child and said, well, we can't simply leave them on their own, but we don't know where they come from. That also happened. So in Kamloops, they found the remains. When they found all of these children, a lot of the harms came up. There is the Awasak Association. I invite you to Google that to find missing children. And my parents were among the first signatories to conduct the research. A lot of families are looking for their disappeared children. And some children were also used as guinea pigs by hospitals. Joyce Ishakwan, as you can see, my sweatshirt, that's our little sister. That's Joyce Ishakwan, who sadly died at the Joliette Hospital on September 28th, 2020. She's beautiful, no? She's wonderful. She looks like me. She was my little sister. That was during an activity that we were holding with young girls. I was already a worker at that time, and we've been doing that for a long time. We would bring them to the land to reconnect with their Mother Earth, and it was a healing journey. What happened with my little sister is sad. I was there. I was just leaving my dental appointment, and I got the video. I don't know if you've all seen it. It's a horrible video. It was very hard. But today, I'm still working on obtaining justice for Joyce. And there were racist remarks made to my little sister by nurses, by care attendants. Insulting comments were made to her. And you know, afterwards, after she died, I was diagnosed with a precancerous tumor. And I was wondering if I would go to that hospital where my little sister died. And I called my surgeon. I said, look, I can't go there. I'm afraid. And that's what trauma is. I'm afraid of going to that hospital and experiencing the same thing. It's awful that I carry this. And I'm at the hospital. And you know, my name is Ishakwan. We're a name that will never be forgotten, but I received the best possible services at the Joliette Hospital because my name is Ishakwan. So why was it that she had to have those horrible things happen to her for me to get the best possible service? Why? Every time I go there and I defend myself very well, I get the best of services, and it's awful that this had to happen for me to get such good service. And now there are a cultural security agent like Melissa. She worked extremely well in hospitals. She accompanied Atikamekw people It's very emotional, but I'm working for my little sister Joyce Ishakwan. I'm an ambassador for the Joyce Principle right now. There's still a great deal of work ahead to really bring to fore the Joyce Principle in Canada. It's very emotional, but emotions are good. Emotions are about healing. And there's systemic racism. But we're very resilient. We are resilient people. We're strong. We're very strong as women. Then, Debbie, maybe you would like to speak about the forced sterilizations? Thank you. Many Indigenous women were forced to undergo forced sterilizations. They were told, well, you can't have children. And it was deliberate. It was to even further assimilate us. And even today, we have worked with many other women to bring to justice those who did it. My mother went through this. She was sterilized by force, and one of my friends also underwent this forced sterilization. A number of women in our community were subjected to this, as well as in other communities and in other nations as well. They were sterilized without their consent. These were young women, in their 20s. These are very vulnerable women as well. As well, currently, recourse has been filed. There have been lawsuits, and we're supporting women in these class action suits. We're helping women who are demanding ceremonies because it's very difficult for them. To experience this, whereas they could have had more children. They wanted to have families. It's extremely difficult for them and for the families who are having to go through this. We provide a lot of support as well. We work with the Women's Council and Committee as well. We do a lot of work in our Spiritual Women's Network, as we call it. Several of us women hold ceremonies. So what happened is that there was a woman who, as she was giving birth, was asked if she would agree sterilization. But you know, when you're giving birth, you really don't know exactly what that word is. What does it mean exactly? It isn't the right time to ask her when she's in that state. So women would sign and they would agree because they trusted the doctor. And then to realize several months later that when they had their routine exams and even years later when they wanted to have more children, that finally it wasn't working because they no longer had a uterus. There was a woman, we had a first Atikamekw physician, Dr. Louise Basile, who's conducting this research now on this forced sterilization. And that's why I wanted to speak about it, because I also worked at the CSMCQ with Indigenous persons. We had meeting there. In our health center, we had meetings about sterilizations. And what was difficult was to address consent, but in Atikamekw, so that the women would understand what this means. Because often women would say to us, yes, but then you simply tied up. You can just simply untie my tubes and I can have more children. But no, we had to explain that this didn't work because they had not understood what the physician meant to say. And that's what happened. So now we're coming to an interesting topic. So holistic and Atikamekw approach. And we're getting there. Here I am with Melissa. We're working on this. So that's our holistic and Atikamekw approach. So I'll leave it over to Debbie, my sister. I'm familiar with it, but I think we each have our turn to speak. Well, this is the NIN Center. This is when we use the holistic self-care healing process. Basically, what you're doing is focusing on yourself. It's what the Creator gave you. It's the 13 tools that the Creator gave us. It's your mother, people, your feet, your head, your ears, to listen, as well your eyes to see and your nose to smell, your mouth to eat, to speak. Your heart, your sex, your gender. So we have 13 tools that the Creator gave us. And when we speak about the 4 directions, well, there are emotions as well. There is spirituality, our physical being, the intellectual part of us. And here is the medicine wheel that we use with the 4 directions. And when we're speaking about the intellectual aspect, this means that we're learning, we think, we find solutions in our lives. It's about wisdom. It's a lot of thinking that takes place here. Emotions means that we are self-confident. We have that self-confidence. And to also live by your emotions as well is that you're guided by your passion. Passion is what we love to do. And it's the physical activities that we like to take part in. And it's art, because by doing art, that is also a means of healing. While we engage in physical activity, this is a means of healing. We hold a lot of ceremonies, and sometimes these become very emotional. Spirituality means that you are engaging to learn. Is that you're moving through the rites of passage. That is at the heart of indigenous spirituality. As well, we hold meetings every year. We have our meetings. We come together in birthing ceremonies and first step ceremonies. We also have ceremonies that will be across the land. We'll have family meetings. We use medicinal plants. We have rain dances. We have sun dances. We have powwows. Everybody can go to a powwow. Anybody's invited to these meetings. And during powwows, there are different types of dances that we do. We also invite singers and drummers with large drums to come in. And sometimes in a traditional powwow, well, we do have these, but we also have international powwows. We also have competition powwows. and I prefer the traditional ones because there we're able to do ceremonies, and we have sweat lodges that you can take part in as a group, with women only, or with youth as well. Usually there are 3 different sweat lodges that we can participate in. Often as well, as part of our healing methods in our meeting of women, we also have our sharing circle. And we have our talking feather, rather. And I received teachings about the feather. When I got my first feather, it was given to me by my father-in-law, and my husband's family was the first to build an ecotourism camp. And we had a lot of European clients who wanted to be immersed in the Atikamekw culture. And thanks to all of this, I've learned a lot, thanks to my husband's family.
Here you can see half the face of the woman here. I was told with my feather that I would be a great warrior and I would have visions, and we also do numerous sharing circles. These days we've had quite a few because we've had a shock in our community. A young woman was found lifeless through violent acts. And we needed other spiritual guides from other communities. And we did sweat lodges, sharing circles, and it was a time to talk, a time to express ourselves, and to play the drum as well with other families around the circle. And then we use sweetgrass. It's one of our medicines, very sacred medicine for women. And we have families who would go and collect sweetgrass, and we share it between the women. And the drum. We make our drums. We hold workshops for drum making. And there are ceremonies where we go look for teachings. Sometimes we go in the west of Canada. That's what we've done in October, to go get some teachings, because those who live there told us there was a treaty that was done a few years ago, and the treaty said that indigenous peoples from the east would go to the west to prevent losing traditions. And so what I did then is I brought medicine with me. And they, over there, they gave us a ceremony. They invited us to come back as well, so that we can also invite them over here in our territory, because there were people from the west of Canada who came to our territory and felt there was something quite sacred in our territory. And it has to do with this entire energy, this the energy of our history, to protect the territory, protect the animals, where we do vision quests. The animals are, we used to do vision quests and dreams. And this year, we'll have a retreat for 1 week for a vision quest. But there has to be a preparation that comes with that. And we have to mobilize, we have to prepare, because it's 4 days fasting first. And that is done alone in a lodge where you do this preparation for your vision quest. And it's quite sacred. And all these ceremonies had been lost for 50 years. Now it's reappearing, and we are learning, and we also make a lot of sacrifices to learn this again, to take this culture again that had been lost. And when I'm saying sacrifices, it means you cannot consume alcohol or drugs. You have to be alert. You have to be balanced. You have to be open to yourself, to others around you. You have to be humble. Even in powwows, and all the dancers as well, we also have a role to play. And all this are means of healing that we bring to the community, we bring to those who are looking for healing. And so now let's talk about resilience. Resilience. Are you going to say that's over? It's over? So we have peoples that like to laugh a lot. We have a good sense of humor. I think you probably saw that. I worked with the Cirque du Soleil for about 15 years, so I was an instructor, and sometimes I like to goof around, and that's to be more relaxed once in a while. So we are a resilient people. We are a Pacific people, a peace-loving people, and we can have compassion as well. But we do talk loud and clear, and that's what I like. It's called Tepiscuan, this activity. That means, what does it mean, Tepiscuan? That was the name of the St. Maurice River, and it means where the rivers meet. CP means river, and that means where the rivers meet. And we participated in a project. Dr. Stanley Volant got this project organized, about 1,000 kilometers everywhere in Quebec, in the province, to walk for healing. And this is in the Innu language, Tapishquan. And so it was the Innu Meshkuni, which is the way of the human. And I did that with my daughter, who was bullied at school. It was her first year at high school, and she was bullied because she was a little round. And she talked to me about this because it was very hard for her to go through this bullying in her school. And then at one point, we were invited to talk to young people because I was a representative of the Indigenous women of Quebec, and we were sent to welcome a group of young women who arrived from an expedition, and my daughter was about 11 or 12, I think. And when we got there, there was a small girl, the first girl who got there. She had a little skirt, a little beret, and she was walking with her snowshoes. And my daughter saw how strong this little girl was, and she said, "Mommy, I want to do that too." And then year after, we did this walk, this Innu walk, and Tapcon CB, I talked about it earlier. My husband and myself, we are co-founders of this project of portage and canoe camping and portage. And we do this activity of camping and canoeing 300 kilometers long. We go through the rivers, down the rivers, and we do about 13 portages from and it lasts about 13, 14 days. And each community, Atikamekw, invites 15 young people, 2 mentors and 1 elder. And it's quite a big organization, logistically speaking, because we're about 105 people for this. And Sit Managan is something else. I'm a coordinator for tourism in Manawan, and we work with Montreal to for this project, Managan, and it has to do with culture transmission, culture transfer activities that we work with, and we work with other Indigenous resources who to give workshops or information, and it's for 2 weeks, and it's a camp, camping situation for 2 weeks, and it's very interesting because we have people who live in an urban setting, and they come to take part in this activity, and right now we're involved in a project for the next 5 years to have a continuity with other Indigenous communities, because we want to share the load. This is quite demanding, this. And then we also have the Mountain Mamo Walk for people looking for funding for dialysis. Melissa talked about privileges and non-privileges. When people leave for medical reasons, sometimes people do have, when they don't live on reserve, they do have to pay for medical care and medicine and travel and so on. So this is to collect funds. And then there is Atikamekw Pride. Atikamekw Pride. That's in Manawan, 2 or 3 kilometers around there. It's a beautiful site. There are longhouses, small longhouses, and small tents, and we go there and we do sharing circles. And last year, we saw that there were numerous suicides in our community, so we set up crisis groups to talk to the community We have social workers who are there as well. And we go there ourselves as well. Because if we want to help people, we have to help ourselves as well. So we go with Debbie and we do the full moon ceremony with women. We go, we help each other, we care for each other, we listen to each other. And it's a beautiful site. It's opened at all times. There's cooks and people to mend the camp. And also there's some homeless people from the community, homeless men, sometimes women, but homeless men who go there and they start do little jobs there, and they start getting involved in artisanal work, and then they get reintegrated in the community. So towards healing. So there are resources there for couples. Yes, that's one of the things we do as well. A woman I know, sometimes there's counselors from the outside who come and help couples or young teenagers, other people who need to talk. So, or if you're a worker, and you need some time off, I do it often. I go there for a few days and I'm happy, I'm well received there, I'm welcomed, and it's in our territory, and there's canoes, and then there's elders and healers who come there. And Atikamekw proud. We are very proud to be Atikamekw. Atikamekw pride, indeed. We are one of the indigenous peoples who keep the language alive. Some peoples are losing their language, and the language is really part of our identity as well. Can I say something? Go ahead. We're talking about the holistic approach, and what you must remember here is that we reconnect our people with their culture and their identity, because that's what was lost during those 50 years, because this is the reconnection, because that's how you heal. Thank you, Melissa. And this lovely man here, his name is Cesar de Washish. He was a canoe maker, birch canoes, and he would make those, and he said in Atikamekw language, and that means the message he sent to the government, to society, tell them, we've never ceded our land, we've never sold it, we've never traded it, and we've never ruled otherwise with regard to our territory. And this is why we live on our territory as much as possible. And that's it. It's over. It's done. So, any questions, reflections, emotions, feedback, any comments? I'd like to talk about the Joyce Principle. What do you want to target politically with that? That's my question regarding the Joyce Principle. I talked about that with very emotionally, but what we want is we want this principle to be adopted. We want to talk to the politicians. We want to relay that message that we merit. We need to have better services, health services in safety, whether it's psychologist, a physician, community center, a nurse, everywhere we deserve the best services possible. That's the Joyce principle. Of course, I am an ambassador of the Joyce principle. Recently, I had a training regarding that because I don't know politics, although I do know it, but I needed to find out how we're going to change things, how we're going to change politicians, how we're going to talk loud and clear, how we're going to talk to universities and to society in general to get that principle adopted. There's the Jordan principle. Do you know the Jordan principle? You're aware of that principle. Some of you know the Jordan principle. It was a young person who was forgotten in the system as far as social services, and so they taught this principle was set up in order to protect the children in the social services, and we want to do the same with Joyce's principle. For Jordan, it had to do with a disagreement between the feds and the province regarding a decision that had to be taken concerning the who was going to pay the bill for the child's care. He was living with a disability, a heavy disability, and by the time the answer was given, Jordan had died, and so thank you very much. On behalf of Debbie, you had a question. Yes, I wanted to underline that you started with giving each other hugs. I see how important hugs are in your talk, and when you invited us to hug each other, to shake each other's hands. So this was wonderful. Before starting, you even got us to do that. And I found that very powerful as an approach, as a way of doing things. So I wanted to, talk about this, and I wanted to talk about also what it means for you, this physical connection. For me, as a worker, a social worker, I need to know that the other person is a human being, and I'd always be physical with others by reassuring them. I work with a man who had just went to great trauma because his parents had died in a fire in their house, and it took me 3 months for him to even move his head up and down. And I realized then that I was on the way to achieve something, because every morning I would talk to him and he would just be absolutely impervious to the world. And one day he started shaking his head up and down. And every morning I would talk to him. I would say, "Do you need a coffee? Would you like a coffee?" And he'd never answer, never move. I made his coffee. And after 3 months, he shook his head up and down. And that was important. That was an important moment. Any other question? Yes? Sorry. Yes, so we do have the friendship centers, native friendship centers, to work with those who are in urban settings. We lead cultural activities. As far as the territory, being far from the territory, it's difficult because we're in an urban setting, and we try to go to bring them to their communities, the territory, because then they have nature surrounds them. But in the urban setting, we go to these centers. We do group dinners. We do workshops to make earrings and sewing, and we have ceremonies, and everything happens in these centers. We have native centers in 10 of our cities: Montreal, Quebec, Joliette, Trois-Rivières, Latuque, Saguenay, Chicoutimi, and this aims to help people in urban settings. And I also do educational kits for parents in French, in Atikamekw and Innu. And I create games for families in Atikamekw and French. And that's how we do some of the work with them. Is that it? Thank you very much. Thank you.